From when film was first invented, people wanted to make movies about knights. And by doing so, our cultural image of the knight has been blended into myth over generations. The idea of the knight is so far in our historical past, most people only see them in works of fiction. The depiction of historical knights in films is often far from how these characters' real-life counterparts would have acted, and therefore sometimes the image of historical knights in films can be misleading. For example, the historical King Arthur is very different than his depiction in Monty Python, which is more based around the literature and the myths that were created around this character. There is often a motive with these characters' designs, be it artistic or not, and by looking at the historical depictions of knights in films over the course of the 20th century, we may be able to get some insight onto why they are depicted like this. Starting our dive into 20th century knight films, I want to look at Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1929 film, La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc. It's one of the best knight films out there, and I really hope the fact that it's black and white and a silent film doesn't scare you away from watching it, because it's one of the most artistic representations of the knight, in my opinion. It is one of the many films depicting the famous knight Joan of Arc. And when I say many, I mean many. I made a slideshow and everything just to show how many there are. Look at this. And these are only the ones I could find online, so there's probably more out there. So out of all these adaptations, why did I choose to talk about La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc? Is it my favorite one? No. But it's probably the most historically accurate and one of the most unique depictions of Joan. Joan of Arc is a knight who probably needs no introduction, but for the sake of this video I'm going to give her one. She was the famous knight who fought in the 100 Years' War, and was later burned at the stake for being a heretic in the eyes of the church. She claimed that she was the daughter of God, which, to a 15th century church, was not the greatest thing to be said. They would never see a woman as a prophet, and for this reason she was killed. It's ironic because her legacy was so strong that she later became a saint in the eyes of the church. While many Joan films choose to focus on her character during the war, Passion decides to instead focus on her trial. And as for its historical accurateness, well, the writer basically just took the historical transcripts of the actual trial and copy and pasted them as the script. So you can't really get any more historically accurate than that. Stylistically, we see a knight here portrayed in the feminine perspective through an early French experimental style that focuses on Joan's suffering. The vast majority of this film is close-up shots, and the majority of those close-up shots are of lead actress Marie Falconetti's face. By choosing this style, the entire film is very intense, and her beautiful performance conveys the character's emotions perfectly. It may be cliché to say this, but in this silent film, the picture truly does paint 1,000 words. We even see one of the first upside-down shots in film history. This film follows the thematics of the victimized individual going against the masses. In this case, it's Joan versus the church. Looking at this film contemporarily, in 1905 there was a separation of the French church and state, as well as a rise of nationalism in Europe. Literature professor and film critic Josh Matthews even compares the film to novel 1984's Third Part, wherein both we see an individual tortured, and in Joan's case killed, for their words against the censoring centralized power. There is also a visual parallel to the trial of Jesus with the crown of thorns, as the church makes a mockery of this helpless victim of injustice. All in all, La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc is a strong first film with great artistic and historical value. And I wish I could say the same about this next one. Alexander Nevsky is the most famous Russian knight to ever live, so it's no surprise that in 1938 there was a film made depicting him. And with one of the most influential directors of all time, Sergei Eisenstein in charge, it surely had to be good, right? Well, you see, Eisenstein's ideas for the film weren't looked at in the best eyes from dictator at the time, Stalin, who wanted this to be a film that exudes his own beliefs, which basically means he just turned the film into an anti-Western propaganda. Stalin placed Dmitry Vasilyev in charge alongside Eisenstein, who would better include these themes to keep Eisenstein in check. And that he did. The film focuses on the one individual, being Nevsky, who is made to mirror Stalin, and the rest of the film is focused on the collective people of Russia. In fact, no films would be allowed to focus on individuals in the Soviet Union until the Khrushchev Thaw, a short-lasting removal of censorship in art after the death of Stalin. Before the Soviet Thaw, you made a film focusing on the individual, and God forbid said individual was a woman. That's straight to the gulag for you. The film also portrayed Westerners, specifically the Germans, due to it being made during World War II, in a horrible light, who are seen as savages who kill women and burn babies alive. That's not a joke, they actually burn babies. And the film doesn't even try to hide its contemporary parallels between the Teutonic Knights of the film and the Nazis, as the German Catholic bishop is just straight up wearing a swastika on his clothes, as well as some of the promotional art during the war having actual German tanks on them, despite there not being any tanks in the film, as you could probably expect. It is clear this film was propaganda to fuel Stalin's military. The climax of the film even showcases the Germans dying by falling and drowning into a lake of ice, reminiscent of how the Germans would be defeated by the elements during the Russian winter 3 years later. The film also features the Mongols representing the East. When shown in the film, they're never really seen as terrible of an enemy as the Germans, or really seen as an enemy at all. This film might be more relevant today than ever. These anti-Western values that were put into the film are still used to justify senseless wars today, as Putin, seeing himself as the glorified image of Alexander Nevsky, is still justifying war today through anti-Western values. Alexander Nevsky in reality did not care for such causes. In fact, nationalism wasn't even a concept at the time of the Middle Ages. Currently, Putin claims the Western and Nazi influence of NATO is influencing Ukraine, which is of course not its own country and actually part of Russia, and therefore it's justified to go to war. Ironically, now Putin is the one seen killing women and babies and has become just like the Westerners, empirically imposing smaller nations and claiming it as anything but war.
Vänner och fränder, de lade om råd hur de skulle gifta bort sin fränka i år ut i rosen. De lade om råd hur de skulle gifta bort...
Ingmar Bergman's 1957 film, The Seventh Seal, is in my opinion not only one of the greatest films depicting the knight character, but one of the greatest films I've ever seen. If you don't mind the black and white and the Swedish language in this film, it's a must-watch. Following Knight Antonius Block's return to Sweden after fighting in the Crusades, where he finds the Black Death has struck his home. Medieval film critic John Aberth argues that Block was probably not returning from crusading in Jerusalem, but instead Novgorod, Russia, same place that Alexander Nevsky was living 90 years after his death. John Aberth argues this since 2 years before the Black Death hit Sweden in 1348, King Magnus of Sweden declared a crusade against Novgorod, ending in Swedish defeat. The entire film follows an extended metaphor of Block playing a game of chess with the personification of death. Modern psychology is portrayed in the lens of the Middle Ages, with Block's faith constantly being put into question. But he eventually chooses to die to save the movie's acting couple from death themselves. This family is reminiscent of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, These parallels are strengthened from the character Yof, who sees visions of the dead throughout the film, seeing not only the Virgin Mary, but Death himself in the climax. Bloch choosing to die to save the film's holy characters makes himself reminiscent to Jesus. Bergman shot the film in black and white, and here it's very much an artistic choice rather than the limitations in color technology, since they were available at the time. I would argue Bergman uses this aesthetic to follow the extended metaphor of chess, where the two sides are black and white. Death ends up playing the black side, not only to represent how he's the personification of the Black Death, but also Bloch's internal struggle for purity and nobility, representing how he is the white being overtaken in the game by blackness or darkness. The chess game is definitely up to interpretations, but the way I interpret it is that he's not physically playing chess with Death himself, but it's a showcase of his internal battle of nihilism and existentialism, and how he struggles to keep his faith. Temporary themes Bergman displays in his film, as stated by himself, are, quote, "In my film, the crusader returns from the crusades, as the soldier returns from the war today. In the Middle Ages, men lived in terror of the plague. Today they in fear of the atomic bomb. The seventh seal is an allegory with a theme that is quite simple. Man, his internal search for God, with death his only certainty."
La historia militar, esta España singular, siempre se encuentra un soldado que la lleva a triunfar.
When the lead actor of your film claims their biggest inspiration is Alexander Nevsky, you know that the film is already heading in the wrong direction. Anthony Mann's 1961 film El Cid follows Nevsky's approach to propaganda, shifting the historical narrative of a famous knight who unites their country even before such ideals of nationalism existed. This time, the film is used to promote Spanish fascism through dictator Francisco Franco. In the film, the Cid, or Rodrigo, takes the city of Valencia in the name of his lord Alfonso, and the Christian and Moor people, which contradicts the actual history where he took Valencia for himself and for profit. Most of these historical inaccuracies come from historical consultant Ramon Patel, who would accept later mythical narratives of the Cid as historical fact. One example of this in the film is when Rodrigo single-handedly takes out 13 men, which would benefit the King Alfonso. This actually never happened and is only written in a later poem about the Cid. Pidal clearly had a nationalist agenda linked with Franco, who wanted to portray his vision of the Cid to Mann as a Spanish patriot who would unite Spain. Similarly to how Nevsky was chosen to mirror Stalin, the Cid was shown to mirror Franco's life, as they were both exiled, and after exilation both led armies, as the film portrays Franco's mission to unify Spain under fascism. The film portrays the idea that there are good and bad Moors, the good ones being the nationalists, and the bad ones needing to be eliminated. From a modern lens, it is shockingly reminiscent to how American Islamophobia occurred after 9/11, but contemporarily this was used to perpetuate the Red Scare in the 60s. The idea to divide the people by creating a witch hunt, saying that anyone who wasn't a full-on fascist is a communist bad guy and must be eliminated. As you can see through films like Nevsky and El Cid, shifting historical narratives of famous knights for propaganda is common due to our glorified ideals of these characters and the myth that we create for them. In 1975, the knight genre and medieval genre as a whole had the time for tropes to become commonality. Terry Gilliam and Jones's Monty Python and the Holy Grail takes these tropes and creates a satire deconstruction of the genre as a whole, through Dada and absurdist influence. The film is great because it takes aspects of both the actual medieval history and myth of the King Arthur and flips them on their head to create the timeless comedy. And the comedy is timeless. When I say it's the funniest movie I've ever seen, I'm not even exaggerating. I thought for this film in particular, I would go through all the nods to medieval history and film technologies I could find. The film opens up with the comedic deconstruction of subtitles and opening credits, fading into Arthur galloping on air, with his servant imitating Foley sound artists banging coconuts together to make the sound of a horse's hooves. Since their very limited budget of the film couldn't allow for actual horses to be bought, they decided to make a joke out of it. The film shows a modern deconstruction of the Arthur myth through an anarcho-communist viewpoint, critiquing how Arthur was never really voted or accepted by the people to be king, and instead he just took out a sword and called himself a king, and everyone went along with it. Later, the film shows people hitting themselves with planks, which is a Dadaist play on how people would whip themselves during the plague, as well as in the same scene commentating on the idiocracy of witch trials. Medieval art is deconstructed through the Dadaist lens, showing angels playing trumpets out of their ass. The film even has a scene commentating on how medieval gender and sex is often portrayed through the male gaze throughout the night genre. The previous film El Cid is a great example of this. The scene shows the Beguine women and nuns through the male gaze, and even commentates past the fourth wall on how they should have cut the scene altogether.
Do you think this scene should have been cut? We were so worried when the boys were writing it, but now we're glad. It's better than some of the previous scenes, I think.
The whole film has metafictional undertones stylized as a documentary, which arise at its ending, where the film commentates on the fact that it is a film, where Arthur is arrested, and it ends abruptly with no conclusion. Monty Python, through its Dadaist satire, commentates on the common tropes of the medieval film genre, and all in all it is a very artistic interpretation of the night and the genre as a whole. Ending off the 20th century night films, I have to talk about Mel Gibson's 1995 film Braveheart, which follows the character of the Scottish knight William Wallace. The film is full of Religous-Right influenced male gaze. Inspired by the hard-body films of the 80s, it follows conservative ideas during the Reagan era. Braveheart is full of the idea that the rise of feminine and military failure in Vietnam is proof that the patriarchy needs to stay in place, and the only way to do that is through muscles, I guess? Yeah, this film sees Mel Gibson shirtless a lot, and is clearly influenced by the hard-body heroes, following their ideas of militarism, patriotism, and family values to appeal to the religious right. Wallace in the film is seen as a Catholic martyr, fighting for Scottish freedom against the pagan English King Edward I.
I shall tell you of William Wallace. Historians from England will say I am a liar, but history is written by those who have hanged heroes. The King of Scotland had died without a son, and the King of England, a cruel pagan known as Edward the Longshanks, claimed the throne of Scotland for himself.
A king who has no historical merit of even being pagan. The film shows our Catholic hero speaking Latin throughout it, the official language of the Church. And despite Gibson supposedly caring so much about language in the film, we never see the Scots speaking Gaelic, or the English aristocrats speaking French, which they would at this time period. So much for that importance of language that Gibson claims he put into the film. The film also appeals to the religious right by having the enemies be English, who are taking away the Scots' freedom, which mirrors the American Revolutionary War. The biggest problem of this film is the homophobia in it. The Scots are seen as a heteronormative state, while the English are soon to be led by Prince Edward II, who is gay.
Gay leaders bed. Can't have no gay leaders, nope. Am I right, my fellow Americans?
Edward's wife, the French Princess Isabella, is of course disgusted by Edward's sexuality and ends up having an affair with Wallace himself, because he's a real man. He has muscles and can speak bad Latin. This affair leads to the future heir of the English throne being Wallace's son rather than Edward's. And the thing is, none of this at all is historically accurate. Isabella did not actually give birth to her only son until 7 years after Wallace was killed. So, unless he was doing something as a ghost, there's no way that's his son. The prince was probably not even gay, but in the modern sense bisexual, since in the Middle Ages there wasn't a term for homosexuality, but instead any sexual act that wasn't for birth was all grouped together into sodomy. Edward having 4 children with multiple women, one of which being Isabella, shows that he probably wasn't gay and instead bisexual in our modern understanding. Gibson's version of Wallace is far from the actual history of this character, and perpetuates the homophobia and evangelical values of the religious right that were a part of the Ronald Reagan presidency. I hope that through just looking through those movies that might have found one to watch or were at least entertained. I highly recommend the Seventh Seal, and you might hate me for saying it, but Alexander Nevsky, let's go. Watching that as like a 21st century person is amazing, and it's hilarious, and just watch it.